Somewhere in the cold ground of the north, under 1,000 winters of rain and frost, under the slow, patient pressure of roots and silt and forgetting, archaeologists keep pulling the same small object out of the dark. It is not gold. It is not silver. It is not a blade. It is something far stranger than treasure, because of what it quietly insists about the men we thought we had understood for 1,000 years. They find combs of antler and bone, carved with patience, sometimes ornamented, sometimes tucked into their own little fitted cases, the way you might keep a pair of reading glasses. They find them in the graves of warriors, and in the graves of farmers, in the graves of grandmothers, and in the graves of children too young to have lived a single season of war. They find them beside the rich and beside the poor, with no regard for the difference. They find them so reliably that a person who has spent a career opening northern graves comes to expect the comb the way you would expect to find a phone in the pocket of someone who died in our own century. Wherever these people went, and they went almost everywhere a wooden hull could carry a human being, they carried something to keep themselves clean. Hold that image, a comb of carved bone, worn smooth by a hand that has been dust for 1,000 years. Because the men who were buried clutching those combs are the very same men we have spent 10 centuries teaching our children to call savages. You know the picture. We have all carried it since we were small. The towering brute with the matted beard and the wild eyes, the horns curling up from the helmet, the axe dripping, the burning church on the headland and the screaming, and the longship sliding back out into the fog with its hold full of stolen gold and stolen people. The barbarian at the edge of the civilized world, filthy and godless and cruel, a force of nature with a human face, arriving without warning and leaving nothing behind but ash. Almost none of it is true. Start with the horns, because the horns are the easy lie, the one that comes apart the moment you touch it. In the whole vast record of these people, in their graves, in the testimony of their enemies, in the thousands of carved stones and weapons and ornaments they left in the earth, there is not one helmet with horns on it. Not one. The horned helmet is a costume. It was sewn together in the 19th century by opera designers and romantic painters and nationalists hungry for a glorious ancestral myth. And it was pulled down over the heads of the dead like a mask, and it has stayed there ever since. Horns on a helmet would have been worse than useless in a real fight. A handle for your enemy to grab, a snag waiting to happen, a way to get your own skull twisted off your neck. The men who actually fought wore plain iron caps, or nothing at all but their own combed hair. The horns were placed on them centuries later by people who needed them to look like monsters. And once you have pulled off one mask, you start to wonder how many others are still there. So pull another. The filth. We picture them as reeking, lice-ridden, strangers to soap and water. The truth runs almost exactly backward. By the testimony of the people who hated them most, these were among the most fastidiously clean human beings in the medieval world. They bathed, they groomed. In their own language, the word that still survives today for one particular day of the week, the day we would call Saturday, meant quite literally washing day. An entire day of the week, every single week, set aside for the bath. There is a complaint that comes down to us from an Englishman of the time, an irritated churchman grumbling that these northern intruders combed their hair and bathed and changed their clothes far too often, and that because of all this unmanly attention to their appearance, they were proving entirely too successful at seducing the wives and daughters of honest Englishmen. Let that one settle for a moment. The earliest detailed complaint we have from the people being raided is not that the raiders were filthy beasts. It is that they were too clean, too well-groomed, and far too attractive. That is not a detail you will find on the horned helmet poster. So which is it? Were they monsters? Or were they meticulous men with carved combs and a weekly bath? Men who wore eyeliner of a kind and braided their beards and dressed in colors so bright we would find them garish. Silk from the far side of the world, furs, glass beads, silver wound through the hair. The honest answer, The answer that this whole journey is going to circle and never quite let you stop circling is that they were both. And neither. And something much larger and stranger and more human than either word can hold. But here's the question that should be making you uncomfortable already. If almost everything in the popular picture is wrong, the horns, the filth, the mindless savagery, then where did the picture come from? Who painted it? And why have we trusted it for 1,000 years? The answer is the foundation that this entire story is built on. So I am going to lay it down now, plainly, and ask you to keep it under your feet for the next 2 hours. We learned about these people almost entirely from the people they terrified. Think about what that means. The men in the longships did not write, not in the way we mean it. They had a writing system, a spare, angular alphabet of straight lines designed to be cut into wood and stone, but they used it the way you might use a chisel and a tombstone, for short and serious things. A name, a boast, a curse, a few words for the dead. They did not keep chronicles. They did not write histories of themselves. They did not sit down to explain, for the benefit of the future, who they were and what they wanted, and what it felt like to be alive inside their own skins. For the most part, they left the future nothing but objects, and graves, and silence. So almost every written word we have about them for the first 200 years was written by their victims, by the monks whose monasteries they burned, by the priests whose brothers they killed and whose treasures they carried off, by the literate, frightened, grieving survivors of the very communities these men had torn apart. The history of the Viking Age, for centuries, was a history written by the people standing in the smoking ruins, looking out at the sea, trying to find words for what had just happened to them. Now ask yourself a simple question. If the only record of your life were written by your worst enemy, in the worst hour of their life, by candlelight, with your knife still at their throat, how much of it do you think would be true? This is the wound at the center of everything we are about to do. We are going to spend the next 2 hours trying to reach across 1,000 years and a wall of someone else's terror and touch the actual human beings on the other side. The man with the comb in his pocket, the woman with the keys at her belt, the child in the dark of the longhouse listening to the wind, the slave whose name we will never know. We are going to try to reach the people, not the monsters, and we are going to have to do it using almost nothing but the things they left in the ground, because they themselves left us so few words. And the deepest, strangest part of all of it, the part that I want you to feel building in the back of your mind through everything that follows, is that this entire world, this whole way of being alive, this people who bathed and braided and sailed to the edge of the known earth and built a civilization of farms and poems and gods, did not simply fade. It was not gently absorbed into the long story of Europe. It ended, deliberately. Within a few short generations, the thing these people were was overwritten by new gods, by new kings, by a new world that they themselves had helped to build, until almost nothing of the old way survived, except the things too deep in the ground or too deep in the language to be reached and erased. So this is not a story about raiders. This is a story about a world that vanished, and about the people who lived inside it without ever once suspecting that it would. To find them, we have to begin where the rest of the world first met them, in fire. On a small island on a summer morning at the very edge of the sea, the 8th of June, in the year 793. The place is a low green island off the northeast coast of what we now call England, a thin strip of land called Lindisfarne, cut off from the mainland twice a day by the tide, so that for hours at a stretch it floats alone in the gray water, neither truly island nor truly shore. On it stands a monastery, and not just any monastery. Lindisfarne is one of the holiest places in the entire Christian world of the North, a center of learning and prayer and unimaginable wealth, where monks have spent generations bent over manuscripts, painting the Word of God in gold leaf and crushed lapis, where the bones of saints lie in jeweled boxes, where the most precious objects of the age are gathered behind nothing more than the assumption that no one would ever dare. It is, in every sense that mattered to the people who lived there, untouchable. Protected not by walls or soldiers, but by holiness itself. To raise a hand against this place was to raise a hand against God, and everyone in the known world understood that. And so the monastery sat there on its tidal island, fat and bright and entirely undefended, for the same reason a man leaves his treasure in plain sight in a town where everyone shares his faith, because the protection was supposed to be invisible, because the protection was supposed to be enough. On the morning of the 8th of June, ships came out of the sea. We have to be careful here, because we know this moment almost entirely through the stunned words of the men it happened to, and their words are soaked in horror and in the desperate need to make the horror mean something. They wrote that the sky had given warnings, that there had been terrible lightnings, that fiery dragons had been seen flying through the air, that a great famine had come. They wrote it the way people always write about catastrophe after the fact, reaching backward to find the omens that must surely have been there, because the alternative, that it came from nowhere, for no reason, with no warning at all, was simply too much to bear. But strip away the dragons in the sky, and what is left is this. Strange ships appeared off a holy island. Men came out of them. And they did to Lindisfarne the one thing that the entire moral architecture of that world had declared impossible. They walked into the house of God. And they took everything. And they killed the men who tried to stop them. And they dragged others away in chains to be sold. And they left the altars stripped, and the bodies in the surf, and the most sacred place in the north a smoking, plundered ruin. To us, looking back, it is a raid. A terrible one, but a raid. The kind of violence that has happened in every age of the world. To the people who lived through it, and to everyone who heard the news in the weeks and months that followed, it was something far worse than violence. It was a terror in reality. A scholar of the age, a famous and learned man, wrote a letter afterward that still carries the sound of a mind unable to find its footing. He wrote, and I will give you the shape of it, not his exact words, that never before had such a horror been seen in Britain, that no one had imagined such a raid was even possible, that the Church of the Holy Saint had been spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its ornaments, given over to the heathen. He could not understand it. None of them could. The question that ran through every chronicle and every letter in those years was not, how do we fight them? It was, how is this allowed to happen? What have we done that God would let the heathens come up out of the sea and do this to his own house? And that question, that uncomprehending, terrified question, is the lens through which the entire Western world would see these people for the next 1,000 years. The Viking Age did not begin with the raiders. It began, for everyone else, with the raided. It began with a scream, written down by a frightened monk, that we have been hearing ever since. But here is what the monk could not have known, bent over his vellum, trying to make sense of the unmakeable. The men who came out of the sea at Lindisfarne were not demons. They were not a punishment. They were not even, in any sense the monk would have recognized, evil. They were farmers' sons and traders' sons from the cold green valleys of the far north, and they had come for a reason as old and as human as hunger. And to understand that reason, to understand why, in this particular century, the ships began to come, we have to leave the burning island behind and sail back across the gray water to the place these men came from, to the world that made them. Because something had changed in the north. Something had built up, year after year, in those long fjords and crowded farms, like water rising slowly behind a wall. And in the year 793, the wall broke. The question is why? Picture the North as it actually was, and not as the maps make it look. We draw it now as a clean trio of nations, neat and settled, but in the 8th century there were no nations there at all. There was a long, broken, magnificent coastline of mountains and forest and ice, threaded with the deep flooded valleys we call fjords, where the only flat and fertile land was the thin green ribbon along the water's edge. There was no center, no capital, no king who ruled it all. There were hundreds upon hundreds of small communities, each clinging to its own scrap of arable ground between the mountain and the sea, each ruled by its own chieftain or its own stubborn family, each looking out at the same hard truth. There was not enough land. This is the quiet engine under everything, and it is so undramatic that it almost disappears next to the dragons and the burning churches, but it is the thing that actually lit the fire. In the cold valleys of the north, good farmland was desperately scarce, hemmed in by rock and water and the short, brutal growing season. And the families that worked that land were not small. A successful farmer might have many sons, and the land, by custom and by hard arithmetic, could not simply be cut into smaller and smaller pieces forever. Or within a few generations, every farm would be too small to feed the family living on it. So a pressure built. In farmhouse after farmhouse, up and down that endless coast, there were young men, strong, restless, well-fed enough to be ambitious, but landless enough to be desperate, who could see, with perfect clarity, that there was no future for them at home. The farm would go to a brother. The good marriage would go to a man with land. The respect, the standing, the very possibility of becoming someone was closed to them at birth by an accident of being born second, or third, or fifth. They were trapped in a beautiful, narrow, crowded country with nowhere to grow. Now hold that pressure in your mind. All those landless, ambitious, dangerous young men, and add to it the one thing that turns pressure into an explosion: a way out. Because at the very same moment that the North was filling up with young men who needed somewhere to go, two other things were quietly falling into place. And the meeting of all three is the secret birth of the Viking Age. The first was knowledge. These were not ignorant men staring out at an empty horizon. They were the children of generations of seafarers and traders. They had heard the stories that came back up the coast with the merchants and the fishermen. Stories of the lands across the water to the south and the west. The soft green kingdoms of the Franks and the English and the Irish. And the most important detail in all those stories, the one that would change the history of the world, was this: those lands were rich and they were soft. And the richest places of all, the monasteries, the churches, the holy houses stuffed with gold and silver and silk and grain, were not guarded at all. They sat open and gleaming on the coastlines and the riverbanks, protected by nothing but a faith the men of the North did not share and did not fear. To a Christian, the monastery was the safest place on earth. To a man who had never heard of that Christian God, or who had heard of him and shrugged, the monastery was simply the single richest, most defenseless target a raider could possibly dream of. All that wealth, no walls, no soldiers, just monks. It was, from a certain cold and terrible point of view, an opportunity so perfect that it is almost surprising it took as long as it did. But the desire to reach those riches was nothing new. Men had wanted other men's gold since there was gold to want. What changed, the second thing, the thing without which none of the rest could have happened, was that for the first time in human history, the men of the North had built a machine that could actually take them there, quietly, quickly, across open ocean, and land them on any beach, up any river, in any shallow estuary, before anyone on shore even knew they were coming. They had built the ship. And the ship, the long, slim, terrifying, beautiful ship, is the true protagonist of this entire age. It is the key that unlocked the door. It is the thing that turned a coast full of restless farmer sons into the most far-traveling people the world had yet seen. Everything that follows, the raids and the trade and the settlement, the kingdoms founded and the rivers explored, the silver of Baghdad and the streets of Constantinople, and a Norse child born on the shore of North America 500 years before Columbus. All of it begins with the thing they learned to build in the boatyards of the North. So before we sail with them, we have to understand the ship, not as a museum piece, not as a diagram, but as the men who built it understood it, as the most advanced, most dangerous, most liberating piece of technology in the entire medieval world. As the thing that took a people locked inside a narrow country and handed them the whole of the open sea. We have to understand how it felt to build a longship. And then we have to understand the far worse thing, how it felt to be inside one, in the middle of the ocean, in the dark, with the water coming over the side, and nothing between you and the bottom of the sea but a few inches of overlapping oak and the steadiness of your own nerve. To build a longship, you did not start with a plan. You started with a tree. There were no blueprints in the boatyards of the north, no measured drawings, no written instructions of any kind. The knowledge of how to summon a ship out of a forest lived entirely inside the heads and the hands of the men who did it, passed down from father to son and master to apprentice across uncounted generations, refined and refined and refined again by every storm that ever swallowed a boat that was not quite good enough. A longship was not designed. It was remembered. It was the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 drownings, carried in the bodies of the men who had survived to teach it. And it began with the right tree. A great oak, ancient and straight, chosen with a care that bordered on reverence, because the keel, the long backbone running the whole length of the hull, had to be cut from a single timber, and a single flaw hidden in the grain could mean the difference between a ship that crossed an ocean and a ship that came apart in the middle of one. The shipwright would walk the forest, reading the trees the way another man might read a face, looking for the tree whose natural curves matched the curves the ship would need, because they did not bend the wood to fit the design, they found the design already living inside the wood and freed it. Think about the patience in that, the forethought. The man choosing the tree for a ship's frame might be choosing it for a ship his sons would sail after he was dead. There was nothing hasty in these people, nothing crude, whatever the burning monasteries might suggest. The same hands that would one day haul plunder out of a ruined church first spent weeks, months splitting oak along the grain with wedges, never sawing it, always splitting, because a split plank follows the natural lines of the wood and stays strong, while a sawn plank cuts across them and weakens. Every choice was like this. Every choice was the difference between life and the cold green water. The planks they split were long and thin and supple, and they laid them not edge to edge, but overlapping, each plank lapping over the one below it like the feathers of a bird or the shingles of a roof, fastened together with iron rivets, hammered through and bent flat on the inside. This was the secret. This overlapping skin, we call it clinker building, gave the hull something almost no other vessel of the age possessed. It gave it flex. A longship did not fight the sea, it moved with it. The whole hull could twist and bend and breathe with the waves, riding the swell like a living thing, where a stiffer vessel would have been hammered to pieces. Sailors who knew these ships spoke of the way the hull seemed to come alive under them in a heavy sea, the planks working against one another, the whole structure shuddering and giving and recovering, alive, supple, almost serpentine. And that flex was bought at a price, and the price was terror. Because a hull that bends is a hull that lets the sea in. Always. There was no longship that did not leak. Every voyage, no matter how fine the ship, was a slow argument between the men inside and the water trying to get in. And the men kept their side of the argument, with buckets and bailing scoops and the endless, aching, never-finished labor of throwing the sea back out over the side, hour after hour, day after day, all the way across the open ocean. The genius of the longship was not only its strength, it was its shallowness. The hull drew almost no water. A fully laden longship might float in the depth of a man's knee. And that single quality changed everything about what these men could do. A deep-keeled ship is a prisoner of the deep harbor. It can only come to land where the water is deep enough to float it, which means it can be seen coming and met and stopped. But a longship could run straight up onto an open beach. It could be rowed far up a shallow river, deep into the soft interior of a country, into places no seagoing vessel had ever been able to reach. It could appear, suddenly, in the heart of a kingdom that thought itself safe because it lay miles from the sea. There was nowhere the longship could not go, no coast too shallow, no river too small, no town far enough inland to sleep easy. Imagine being one of the people on the other end of that. You live in a village on a river, 20, 30, 50 miles from the open sea. The sea is a danger that belongs to other people, fishermen and fools. You have never in your life feared an attack from the water, because no ship could possibly reach you here. And then one morning, around a bend in your gentle inland river, where there has never been anything larger than a fishing punt, comes a long, low, dark shape full of armed men, gliding silent and shallow over water you thought was your protection. And you understand, in the half-second before everything you love is on fire, that the rules you grew up trusting do not apply anymore, and never will again. That half-second of understanding, that is the Viking Age, distilled. The arrival of a thing the world had no defense against, because the world did not yet know it existed. And then there was the sail. For most of their history, the ships of the North had been driven by oars alone, beautiful but limited, prisoners of the strength of the men inside them. Somewhere in the centuries before the raids began, the men of the North mastered the sail, and the marriage of the sail and the slim, clinker hull produced something genuinely new in the world. A ship that could cross open ocean under the power of the wind, fast and far, and then, when the wind died or the wind turned hostile or the moment came to strike, drop the mast, run out the oars, and move with a low, hunting, silent power that no sailing ship could match. Wind for distance, oars for the kill. It was the perfect machine for what they meant to do, and they did not invent it on purpose, the way we invent things now, in rooms, on schedules. They grew it, slowly, out of need and water, and the deaths of everyone who got it slightly wrong. And here we should pause on the strangest beauty of all, because these were not only weapons. These ships were loved. We know this with certainty because of how they were buried. When a great chieftain or a powerful woman of the North died, they were sometimes laid to rest not in the ground, but inside a ship, a real, complete, ocean-capable vessel, dragged up out of the water and set into a great pit and filled with everything the dead would need for the journey out of this world and into the next. We have found these ship burials preserved in the clay, and they have taught us more than 10,000 chronicles ever could. We have looked at the actual timbers, the actual rivets, the actual carved prow rising up out of the earth where it was buried with someone beloved more than 1,000 years ago. And the carving on those ships, the spiraling, interlocking, impossibly intricate animals coiling along the prow and the steering oar, beasts biting beasts in patterns that fold back into themselves forever, tells you everything the burning monasteries hide. These were not crude men. The same culture that produced the axe produced that carving. The hand that held the sword held the chisel. The longship was their cathedral, their poem, their highest art, and it happened to also be the most effective instrument of violence and exploration the world had yet seen. And they saw no contradiction in that at all, because they did not divide the world the way we do, into the beautiful and the brutal. To them, a thing could be both. A man could be both. The whole age was both, all the way down. But we keep talking about the ship as an object, and that is the easy way to talk about it, because the object survives and the experience does not. So let me try to give you the experience, because the experience is the thing that should make your stomach turn over. You are aboard. The ship is perhaps 70 feet long and barely 16 wide, narrower than a single room of an ordinary house, and into that narrow strip are packed dozens of men, their sea chests, their weapons, their food, their water, their plunder if the voyage has gone well, and the constant intruding sea sloshing in the bottom. There is no deck below to shelter in. There is no cabin, there is no roof. There is the open sky and the open sea, and the strip of working oak beneath you, and that is all there is, for as long as the voyage takes, and the voyage might take weeks. You sleep, when you sleep at all, sitting up or curled on the bare wet planks among the other men, soaked to the skin, in a cold that does not relent for an instant, day or night. The wind that drives you forward is the same wind that flays you. There is no fire. You cannot light a fire inside a wooden ship full of tar and rope. So there is no hot food, no warmth, nothing but cold meat and cold fish and hard bread softened in cold water, eaten with cold hands. And under all of it, every waking moment and every sleeping one, is the knowledge that the only thing between you and the bottom of the ocean is a hull thin enough to flex like a living rib cage, leaking steadily, kept afloat only by the men beside you, bailing in shifts that never end. And there is one thing more, the thing that should genuinely stop your breath. They had almost no way of knowing where they were. Think about that. They were crossing hundreds of miles of open, featureless, lethal ocean, the North Atlantic, one of the most dangerous bodies of water on the surface of the Earth. And they had no compass, no charts of the kind we would recognize, no instruments to fix their position. They navigated by a knowledge so deep and so intuitive that we still do not fully understand how it worked. They read the sun and the stars when they could see them. They read the color of the water and the temperature of it. They watched the patterns of the swells, the long rolling memory of distant storms, and could feel in the motion of the hull which way the open ocean lay. They watched the birds, knew which birds flew out from land in the morning and back to it at night, and followed them home. They watched the clouds, because clouds gather over land that is still below the horizon. There are even hints, still argued over, that on overcast days they used a certain crystal that could find the hidden sun through the cloud by the way it bent the light. They navigated, in short, by reading the entire living surface of the world as a single, vast text. And they did it well enough to find an island the size of Iceland in the middle of the empty Atlantic, again and again, and to come home. But sometimes, they did not come home. And here the silence of the record becomes its own kind of testimony. For every voyage that made it into the sagas, for every landfall remembered and every settlement founded, there were the voyages no one ever wrote about, because no one came back to write them. Ships that sailed west into the gray morning and were simply never seen again. Whole crews, fathers, sons, brothers, swallowed without a word, leaving behind only a wife on a far shore who watched the horizon for a sail that would never come, and watched it for months, and then for years, and then stopped watching, and grew old, and never knew. We have no record of those men. We have no names for them. The sea took them and kept them, and they vanished out of history entirely, as if they had never pushed off from the beach at all. The runestones remember a few of them. Those terse, angular memorials I told you about. The closest thing these people left to writing about themselves. Up and down the Old North you can still find them, carved by the families of the lost. A stone raised by a mother for a son who, the carving says simply, died in the East. A stone for a man who fed the eagles in some far land, which is their stark and beautiful way of saying he fell in battle, and his body was left for the carrion birds, far from home, in ground his family would never see. A stone for the crew of a ship that never returned. These stones are not history. They are grief, made permanent. They are a mother standing on a cold hillside, refusing to let her son be erased, carving his name into the only thing that lasts longer than memory. And they are, I think, the truest thing these people ever said about themselves. That they knew the sea would take some of them, that they sailed anyway, and that the ones left behind found a way to make the silence speak. So that is the ship, the key, the cathedral, the coffin, the thing that handed a people the whole world and asked, in return, only that some of them never come back. And now that we have built it, and felt the terror of being inside it, we have to ask the question that the burning monasteries would never let us ask. What were they sailing home to? Because here is the truth that the entire popular picture works to hide. The vast, overwhelming majority of these people were not raiders at all. The men in the longships at Lindisfarne were a tiny, violent, visible fraction of an enormous population that spent its life doing something almost no one ever paints or films or remembers. They were farmers. They were parents. They went raiding the way a man today might leave home to work the oil fields or the merchant ships, for a season, for a few years, for the money, because there was nothing for him at home. And then, if he lived, he came back. Back to the farm, back to the longhouse in the dark valley, back to the wife and the children and the animals and the endless grinding labor of staying alive in a hard country through a long winter. That world, the world they left to go raiding, and the world they were so desperate to come home to, is the world we have to enter now. The real world. The one without the horns. The one with the smoke and the cattle and the children and the long, long dark. Come inland with me then, away from the beaches and the burning churches, into a cold green valley as the light is failing. There is a building here, long and low, its turf roof so thick with growing grass that from a distance you might mistake it for a swelling of the ground itself, a hill that smokes. This is the Longhouse. This is the center of the world. Not the world of the chronicles, but the actual world, the one almost every single one of these people was born into, lived in, and died in. A longhouse was exactly what its name says, long. A single great room, sometimes 100 feet from end to end, with low walls of stacked turf or timber or stone, and a high roof held up by 2 long rows of wooden posts. There were few windows, or none at all, because glass did not exist for these people, and an open window in that climate was simply an invitation to the cold. So the inside of the longhouse, for most of the year, was dark, profoundly dark. Lit only by the fire that burned in a long hearth running down the center of the floor, and by whatever gray light leaked in through the doorway and the smoke hole in the roof. We have to slow down here and actually feel this, because it is so far from how any of us has ever lived that it is almost impossible to imagine from the outside, and yet it was the entire physical reality of these people's existence. Picture the smoke. There was no chimney. The fire burned in the open down the middle of the room, and the smoke rose and spread and hung in a thick layer up under the roof before it found its slow way out through the hole above. So the air you breathed, for your entire life, was hazed with wood smoke. It stung the eyes. It blackened the timbers overhead. It got into the clothes, the hair, the lungs, the food. The dead from this age, when we examine them, often show the marks of it in their bodies, lungs scarred by a lifetime of breathing the indoor smoke of the longhouse fire. The warmth of home and the slow poison of home were, quite literally, the same thing. You could not have one without the other. To be warm was to breathe smoke. To stop breathing smoke was to freeze. And along both long walls of this dark, smoky room ran a raised wooden platform, packed earth or planking. And this platform was everything. It was the bench you sat on by day and the bed you slept on by night. There were no separate bedrooms. There was almost no privacy of any kind. The whole household, the farmer and his wife, their children, the elderly parents, the unmarried relatives, the farmhands, the slaves, all of them ate and worked and slept and were born and died along the 2 sides of that single long room, in the smoke, in the dark, packed close together for the warmth their bodies gave off, which in the deep of winter was a warmth they could not afford to waste. And they were not alone in there. In the cold months, the animals came inside too. At one end of the longhouse, often partitioned off but under the same long roof, the cattle and the sheep and the goats were brought in out of the killing cold, partly to keep them alive through the winter, and partly because the heat of a dozen large animals was a heat source the household could not do without. So you slept a few feet from the cows. You woke to the sound and the smell of them. The breath of the animals warmed the people, and the warmth of the people kept the animals from freezing, and the whole thing, humans, beasts, fire, smoke, darkness, was bound together into a single living system whose only purpose, all winter long, was to not die before spring. Because spring was the whole point. Spring was the question every single winter asked. Will you make it to spring? This is the thing the modern mind cannot hold, because we have never had to. For these people, every year was a wager against starvation, and the stakes were the lives of everyone they loved. The growing season in the north was savagely short. There were only so many weeks in which the sun was strong enough and the ground warm enough to grow the grain and the hay that would have to feed every human and every animal on the farm through the long frozen months when nothing grew at all. If the summer was good, you survived. If the summer was poor, if the rains came wrong, if the frost came early, if the harvest fell even a little short, then you would spend the winter watching the stores in the storehouse dwindle faster than the snow outside, doing the arithmetic of survival in your head, deciding which animals to kill and eat now and which to keep alive in the desperate gamble that they would live to breed in the spring, and knowing all the while that if you had judged it wrong, the spring would arrive to find some of the family gone. We tend to imagine these people as warriors, but the enemy that killed most of them was never another man with an axe. It was the cold. It was the dark. It was the slow, grinding hunger of a long winter, and the diseases that swept through the smoky, crowded longhouse. And above all, it was the simple, statistical brutality of being a child in a world without medicine. Look at the graves, and the truth is unbearable and undramatic at once. A great many of the people buried in the northern ground are children, infants, the very young. To bring a child into this world was to gamble that it would live to walk, and then to gamble again that it would live to grow, and to lose those gambles over and over in nearly every family. A woman might give birth many times across her life and watch most of those children go into the ground before they were grown. This was not a tragedy that befell a few unlucky households. This was the ordinary texture of being alive. Grief was not an event. Grief was the weather. And I want you to understand what that does to a way of thinking about the world. Because we are coming, soon, to the gods these people believed in, and the strange, dark philosophy they built about fate and death and courage. And you cannot understand any of it, none of it, unless you first feel the longhouse in winter. Unless you feel what it is to live with death not as a distant fear, but as a member of the household, sleeping on the bench beside you, taking the youngest first, every single year. The famous fatalism of these people, their grim and beautiful idea that the day of your death is already fixed, and the only thing you control is how you meet it. That did not come from nowhere. It came from here, from the smoke and the dark and the buried children. It is the philosophy of people for whom death was simply, finally, undeniably, not negotiable. They built a worldview that could survive the longhouse in winter. We will come back to that, and when we do, I think it will break your heart a little. And then, I think it will steady it. But the longhouse was not only suffering. That is the other half of the truth, and we have to hold both at once, the way they did. Because that same dark, smoky, crowded room was also the warmest, safest, most human place in their world, and they loved it the way you love the only shelter there is. In the long winter evenings, when the work was done and the dark came down at 4 in the afternoon and would not lift until late the next morning, the longhouse became something we have almost entirely lost. A place where the whole community gathered in the firelight with nothing to do but be together. There was no other light to read by, even if most of them could have read, which they could not. There was no entertainment that did not come from a human mouth or a human pair of hands. And so the winters were filled with the things people make when they have only each other, with stories, with poems, with songs, with riddles and boasts, and the long memory of the family carried in spoken words. The fire crackled, the smoke rose, the animals shifted in the dark at the end of the hall, and a voice would lift over all of it and begin to tell. This is where their literature lived, not on a page, but in the air, in the firelit dark, passed from voice to voice across the generations. The great stories, the histories of the families, the deeds of the gods and the heroes, the poems whose every line was bound together by intricate rules of sound and meaning, so dense that scholars still pull them apart like puzzle boxes. All of it was held in living memory and performed, by firelight, in rooms exactly like this one. A skilled poet was prized above almost anyone, welcomed at any hearth, rewarded by kings, because a poet could do the one thing these people wanted more than gold. A poet could make you remembered. A poet could take your deeds and bind them into verse so well made that it would be repeated long after you were dead, carrying your name forward into a future you would never see. And to a people who knew, in their bones, that the body always lost, that the cold always won in the end, that the child always went into the ground, the chance to be remembered was not a vanity. It was the only immortality on offer. It was, very nearly, a religion. So that is the rhythm of the real life. The brutal short summer of relentless work, racing the sun to wring a year's survival out of a few warm weeks. And then the long dark winter in the smoky hall, packed close with family and animals and the ever-present dead, surviving on the stores and the body heat and the stories, waiting for the light to come back, never entirely sure that it would come back for all of them. Work and dark, hunger and warmth, labor and song, the two halves of the year, the two halves of the life, swinging back and forth, year after year, generation after generation, in a valley at the edge of the world. And running this whole impossible operation, the farm, the stores, the survival, the household of humans and animals through the killing winter, was very often not the man at all. Because the man, as we have seen, was frequently gone. Gone raiding, gone trading, gone to sea for a season or a summer or longer, gone perhaps forever to feed the eagles in the east. And when he was gone, the entire weight of the household, the entire life and death machinery of survival, fell onto the shoulders of someone the chronicles almost never mention, and the popular picture has erased almost completely. It fell onto the women. And the women of this world were not what you have been led to expect. Not at all. To understand who actually held these communities together, who ran the farms, who held the keys, who wielded a kind of power that women in much of the rest of the medieval world could only have dreamed of, and who, in a few astonishing and hotly argued cases, may have taken up the sword themselves, we have to look hard at the half of this society that the men who wrote the chronicles barely bothered to see. There is an object that turns up again and again in the graves of the women of the North, and like the comb, it tells you something the chronicles never will. It is a set of keys. In grave after grave, the women were buried with keys, sometimes a single key, sometimes a whole ring of them, often hung from a brooch at the breast or worn at the belt where everyone could see them. And those keys were not decorative. They were not jewelry. They were the unmistakable, publicly understood symbol of an actual authority. And to understand that authority, you have to understand what the keys unlocked. They unlocked the storehouses. They unlocked the chests where the food and the valuables and the year's survival were kept. And in a society where the difference between life and death was whether the household made it from one harvest to the next on the stores it had laid by, the person who held the keys to those stores held something very close to power over life itself. That person was the woman of the house. When a couple married, the keys passed ceremonially into the wife's keeping, and with them passed authority over the entire interior life of the farm, the food, the storage, the dairy, the textiles, the labor of the household, the whole vast domain of everything that happened indoors and everything that kept the family alive. Inside the boundary of the home, the wife's word was, in a real and recognized sense, law. There was even an old understanding that drew a literal line. The man's authority ran from the threshold outward, to the fields and the sea and the wider world, and the woman's authority ran from the threshold inward, to the heart of the household, and within her domain, he did not overrule her. Two sovereigns, one farm. A division of power so clear that it was carried on the body in iron for everyone to see. And now remember the thing we have already established. The men were so often gone. Gone for a season, gone for years, gone forever. And when the man crossed his threshold and walked down to the sea and disappeared over the horizon, his half of the authority did not vanish. It collapsed inward, onto the woman who stayed. She did not merely keep the house while he was away. She ran the entire farm. She made the decisions that meant survival or starvation. She managed the labor, the harvest, the slaughter, the stores, the slaves and the hired hands, the buying and the selling, the defense of the property, the raising of the children, the keeping alive of everything and everyone, for months, for years, alone, with the keys at her belt and the whole weight of the household on her back. The popular picture gives us the man at sea as the hero of the age. But the person who actually held the civilization together, day after grinding day, was very often the woman he left behind to do it. And the law knew it. This is the part that genuinely startles people, because it cuts so hard against everything we assume about how women lived 1,000 years ago. The women of the North had rights that women in much of the rest of the medieval world would not see again for the better part of 1,000 years. A woman could own property in her own name, and keep it, and the property she brought into a marriage remained hers. She could inherit. She could run a business and trade on her own account, and we have the evidence in the graves of women buried with the tools and the scales of a merchant. And, most astonishing of all to the world around them, she could initiate her own divorce. She could. If her husband mistreated her, if he failed to provide, if he struck her, if he was simply intolerable, a woman could, with witnesses, declare the marriage ended, walk out, and take her property with her. There is a famous account, half history and half story, of a woman so insulted by a slap across the face from her husband that years later, when his life depended on her help, she coldly refused it and let him die, and reminded him as he begged of the blow he had given her long before. Whatever the literal truth of that particular tale, it tells you something true about the world that produced it, that a woman's honor was a real and dangerous thing, that an injury to it would be remembered and could be answered, and that a man who mistook his wife for a possession was making a serious mistake about the kind of person she was permitted by her whole society to be. None of this means it was a paradise of equality. It was not. The world still belonged, in most of its public and political life, to men. Women were still expected to marry, to bear children in a world that killed children, to spend their lives in the brutal labor of the household. A woman's choices were narrower than a man's in 100 ways. We should not romanticize it into something it never was. But against the backdrop of the medieval world, against the backdrop of what was happening to women in the soft Christian kingdoms to the south, the women of the North stand out as startlingly powerful. Keepers of the keys, runners of the farms, owners of property, able to walk away from a marriage and take their wealth with them. The barbarians at the edge of the world gave their women a freedom that the civilized South would spend the next millennium slowly taking away. And then there is the question that has set the entire field on fire. The question that people argue about now with a heat that surprises everyone who wanders into it. Did the women fight? For most of the history of these people, the answer everyone gave was simple. No. The sagas were full of fierce women, women who drove the men to vengeance, women who held farms and wielded power and ruled with iron will. But they did it from the hall, not the battlefield. The warrior, in the popular and the scholarly mind alike, was a man. The famous tales of armed shield maidens were treated as exactly that. Tales, legends, the stuff of poetry rather than the stuff of war. And then, not long ago, science walked into one of the most famous warrior graves in the entire North. It was a grave that everyone had known about for more than a century, a high-status burial, richly furnished, found in an old trading town, packed with the full equipment of a professional warrior. A sword, an axe, spears, armor-piercing arrows, 2 horses sacrificed and buried alongside, and, most tellingly of all, a set of gaming pieces, the markers of a board game of strategy, a kind that we believe was associated with military command, with the planning of battles. For over 100 years, every scholar who looked at this grave assumed, without ever quite checking, that the person inside it was a man. Because of course it was a man. Who else would be buried like a general? And then someone finally checked. They tested the actual bones. And the bones were the bones of a woman. I want to be honest with you about this, because the honesty is more interesting than the headline. The discovery did not prove that armies of women fought across the North. It proved one specific, undeniable, electrifying thing. That here, in this one grave, a woman had been buried with the full honors and the full equipment of a high-ranking warrior, in a way her own society clearly thought was appropriate for her. What it does not prove, what we genuinely do not know, is exactly what that meant. Did she fight? Did she command? Was she a warrior in life, or was she honored as one in death for reasons we cannot now recover? The argument rages on, and good scholars stand on every side of it, and anyone who tells you the question is settled is selling you a story rather than the truth. But this much the bones make undeniable, that our 1,000-year-old certainty about who was allowed to be a warrior in this world was, at the very least, too simple. That the line between the hall and the battlefield was not as solid as the men who wrote the chronicles assumed. That there is something in that grave we still do not fully understand, and that the woman in it has been quietly waiting for 1,000 years to make us admit it. But there was one kind of power that belonged to women so completely that even the men who feared it could not pretend otherwise, and it had nothing to do with the sword. It was older and stranger and far more frightening than any blade. It was the power to see. At the edges of these communities, and sometimes at the very center of them, there moved a particular kind of woman whom everyone treated with a careful, fearful respect. The seeress, the wise woman, the practitioner of a deep and dangerous form of magic that was understood to be, above all else, the province of women. She traveled from farm to farm, from settlement to settlement, and when she arrived, she was received with an honor bordering on dread. She would be seated in a high seat, given the finest food, attended to, prepared. And then, with chanting, with ritual, with a special staff that has actually been found buried in the graves of women we believe were these very practitioners, she would go out of herself. She would enter a trance, send her mind out past the walls of the world, and return with knowledge no living person should have been able to possess: the shape of the coming harvest, the fate of the absent, the future itself, the will of the powers that moved beneath everything. And here is the part that should make the hair stand up on your neck. The chief god of these people, the highest of the high, the one-eyed lord of war and wisdom and the dead, even he was said to have learned this magic, this art of seeing, from a goddess. It was woman's knowledge at the root, and the stories carry a strange unease about the fact that he practiced it at all, as if a man stooping to that particular power had crossed a line that left a mark on his honor. The mightiest god in their universe paid a price and reputation for reaching into the domain that belonged to women. That is how real this power was. That is how completely it was understood to be theirs. In a world that gave men the sword and the ship and the open sea, it gave women the keys, the farm, the law's surprising protections, and the terrifying, irreducible, unconquerable power to see what was coming. Which brings us, at last, to the thing under everything. Because that seeress, sitting in her high seat with her staff, sending her mind out past the edge of the world to read the future, what was she actually reading? What did these people believe was written out there in the dark, waiting? To answer that, we have to go where they went on the longest nights, into their gods, into their idea of fate, into the strangest and most beautiful and most quietly devastating answer that any people has ever given to the oldest question there is, the question of how to live when you know with certainty that you are going to die. We have to be careful here, more careful than anywhere else, because this is the place where the silence I warned you about at the very beginning is deepest. The people of the North did not write down their religion. They had no holy book, no scripture, no central authority deciding what was true. Their gods lived where everything else lived, in the spoken word, in the firelit stories, in the rituals performed at the turning of the seasons, in the shape of the world itself. And then their religion died and was replaced, and most of what we know about it comes to us through the writings of their own descendants, men who had become Christians, who set down the old stories generations later, in a new faith, sometimes lovingly, sometimes uneasily, always at a distance. So when I tell you what these people believed, understand that I am holding up a thing that has been broken and reassembled, and that some of the pieces are missing, and that some of the pieces we have may have been reshaped by the very hands that saved them. We are reading a lost faith by the light of the faith that extinguished it. But even through all that distance, even in fragments, what comes through is staggering. Because the universe these people imagined was not a comfort, it was not a promise, it was, at its very heart, a tragedy. And they built their entire way of living on the courage to face it open-eyed. Their world was a great tree. Picture it, an enormous ash, vast beyond imagining, its roots and branches binding together all the realms of existence, the world of the gods, the world of humans, the worlds of giants and the dead and the dark things beneath. Everything that was hung from that tree, and the tree was not safe. It was gnawed at its roots, eaten at by serpents, slowly suffering, slowly dying, held together by forces that were themselves under constant siege. The whole cosmos was a structure under threat, kept standing by effort and vigilance, and everyone in it, gods included, knew that the threat would one day win. Because here is the thing that sets this faith apart from almost every other the human race has ever invented. In most religions, the gods are eternal. The gods win. Whatever happens to us, the divine order endures. The sun keeps rising. The story goes on forever. Not here. The gods of the north were going to die. They knew it. That is the almost unbearable center of the whole thing. The chief of the gods, the one-eyed wanderer, had given his own eye for a single drink from the well of wisdom. And the wisdom he bought with his eye was the knowledge of his own doom. He knew how it would end. He knew that a final battle was coming, a day when the forces of chaos and the giants and the monsters would break loose, when the great wolf would slip its chains and the world serpent would rise from the sea and the sky itself would split, and that on that day the gods would go out to meet their enemies in a battle they already knew they were going to lose. The wolf would swallow the chief god whole. The thunder god, the great defender, the friend of ordinary people, would kill the world serpent and then stagger 9 steps from its venom and fall down dead. The sun would be devoured, the stars would go out, the great tree would shudder, and the world would burn, and then it would sink beneath the sea, and almost everything that had ever been would be gone. And the gods knew all of this, and they went out to fight anyway. That is the philosophy, right there. That is the thing I told you might break your heart and then steady it. Sit with what it means. Their highest beings, their models of how to be, faced certain, total, unavoidable defeat, knew the day, knew the manner, knew that nothing they did could change the outcome, and they did not despair, and they did not surrender, and they did not beg for a different ending. They sharpened their weapons, they gathered their courage. They prepared to meet their doom, standing, fighting, with honor on their feet. The point was never to win. Winning was never available. The point was how you met the end that was coming for you, no matter what. And now you understand the longhouse in winter. Now you understand the buried children, and the ships that never came home, and the cold that always won in the end. These were people for whom defeat was not a fear, but a certainty. The harvest might fail. The child would likely die. The sea would take some of them. The body would lose, every single time, in the end. They lived inside that certainty the way we live inside the air. And so they built a faith in their own image, a faith that did not pretend defeat away, that did not promise a happy ending, that looked the darkness dead in the eye and said, "Yes, we lose, and here is how we lose well." This is why fate sat at the absolute center of their thinking. They believed that the course of every life was already woven, that there were powers, 3 great women at the root of the world tree, who spun and measured and cut the thread of every existence, and that the day of your death was set the moment you were born, fixed, unchangeable, beyond the reach of any prayer or sacrifice or act of will. You could not lengthen your life by being cautious. You could not shorten it by being brave. The day was the day. It was already woven. Now, you might think a belief like that would make people passive. Why act at all? Why strive? Why risk anything if it is all already decided? But it did exactly the opposite. And the reason it did the opposite is the most important psychological insight of the entire age. If the day of your death is already fixed and beyond your control, then your courage costs you nothing. Do you understand? If you cannot die one moment before your appointed time, no matter what you do, then there is no reason on earth to be a coward. Caution buys you nothing. Hiding buys you nothing. The careful man and the bold man die on exactly the same day, the only day available to them. So the only thing that is actually in your hands, the only thing you genuinely get to choose, is not whether you die, but how. Whether you meet your fixed and certain end whimpering or standing. Whether the story they tell about you afterward is one of fear or one of courage. And that is the freedom these people found inside the prison of fate. Not freedom from death, freedom from the fear of it. They could not change when they would die, so they poured everything into the one thing they could change, the manner of it, and the memory of it. They reframed the entire human condition. Death was not the enemy. Death was certain, neutral, scheduled, dull. The enemy was a bad death, a forgotten life, a name that died with the body and left no trace in the world. The thing to fear was not the grave. The thing to fear was being forgotten. Which is why they wanted, more than almost anything, to die well. And why the very worst death imaginable, the death they actually dreaded, was the one most of us would now consider the lucky one. To die old, in bed, of sickness, quietly, in the dark of the longhouse, was, to many of these people, something close to a disgrace. There is even a hint in their stories that those who died that way, the straw death they called it, the death in the bedding, went to a dimmer, lesser place in the world beyond, while the ones who fell fighting were carried somewhere far greater. The whole moral order was inverted from ours. We hoped to die safe and old and warm in our beds. They hoped to die hard and young if need be, and remembered. And here we should be honest and gentle about the most famous part of all of it, the great hall of the slain, the warrior's paradise where the chosen dead were said to feast and fight forever, waiting for the final battle. It is the image everyone knows, but notice what kind of heaven it actually is. It is not a place of rest. It is not peace, not release, not an end to struggle. It is a hall where the dead warriors fight each other every single day, are killed, and rise again whole each evening to feast. And they do this not for joy but for training, sharpening themselves endlessly for the last battle they already know they are going to lose. Even their paradise was a preparation for a defeat. Even their heaven had the doom built into its foundation. There was no escape in their whole imagined universe from the truth that the darkness was coming. There was only the choice of how to stand inside it. I find this, the more I sit with it, almost unbearably moving. Because strip away the gods and the wolves and the world tree, and what these people were really doing was facing, with open eyes and without flinching, the exact same thing every single one of us faces and spends our whole lives trying not to look at. We are going to lose everything. Everyone we love is going to die, and so are we, and the universe is not going to stop. And on a long enough timeline, the sun itself goes out. We know this. We have always known this. And most of human civilization has been, in one way or another, an enormous machinery built to help us not think about it. These people built the opposite. They built a faith and a code and a whole way of living designed to help them think about it, all the time, clearly, and to keep their nerve anyway. To plant the crop knowing the harvest might fail. To love the child knowing the child would likely die. To launch the ship knowing the sea might keep it. To live fully, fiercely, generously, courageously, inside a darkness they refuse to lie to themselves about. There is a single line that survives from their poetry that captures the whole of it. And I will not give it to you in their words, because their words belong to them. But I will give you its meaning, because its meaning belongs to all of us. It says, in essence, this: that your cattle will die, and your family will die, and you yourself will die, every one, without exception. But there is one thing that does not die: the judgment that is passed on a person after they are gone, the memory, the reputation, the story of who you were and how you lived. That alone outlives the grave. That is the only thing you take with you by leaving it behind. And so the whole engine of their lives comes into focus. The raiding, the risk-taking, the open-handed generosity, the obsession with honor and reputation and the keeping of one's word, the poets prized above gold, the rune stones carved by grieving mothers refusing to let a name disappear. All of it was a war against being forgotten. They could not defeat death, no one can. So they did the only thing that was left. They tried to become a story worth retelling. They tried to carve themselves so deep into the memory of the living that they would go on existing, in the only way anything ever truly lasts, long after the body had gone into the cold ground. And the terrible irony, the thing that hangs over this entire age like the long winter dark, is that they were right. Memory is the only immortality there is, but it is fragile. It depends entirely on someone, somewhere, still telling the story. And almost all of their stories are gone. The names on the runestones are mostly names attached to nothing now. A son who died in the east, and we will never know who he was or what he loved or how he laughed or why his mother could not bear to let him vanish. The vast majority of these people, these millions of human beings who lived and feared and hoped and tried so desperately to be remembered, are forgotten as completely as if they had never drawn breath. The immortality they reached for slipped through their fingers across the centuries, name by name by name, until almost nothing was left. Almost nothing. But not quite nothing, because the ground remembers what the living forget. And nowhere does the ground remember more than in the way these people buried their dead. Which is where we have to go now, into the graves themselves, into the single richest source we have for who these people actually were. The way a people treats its dead is the way it tells the truth about what it believes. And the dead of the North have a great deal of truth still to tell us, including one account, one single eyewitness account written down by a horrified outsider of what actually happened at one of these funerals that is so vivid and so dark and so human that once you have heard it, you will never be able to think of these people as a cartoon again. There was no single way to bury the dead in the North, and that itself is a clue to how loosely organized their beliefs really were, how local, how varied. In some places they burned the dead, in others they laid them in the ground unburned. Sometimes the grave was marked with stones set in the shape of a ship, a vessel outlined in boulders to carry the dead on a voyage they would never physically take. Sometimes a person was simply laid in the earth with a few small things, and sometimes, for the greatest of them, they did something so extravagant, so staggeringly costly, that it tells you almost everything about what these people thought death was. They buried them in ships, real ones. We have found these burials, and they are among the most precious things ever pulled out of the European ground, because the conditions preserved them. The clay sealed them, kept out the air, and held the wood and the cloth and the bodies and the grave goods almost as they were laid down more than 1,000 years ago. We have looked into a great burial mound and found an entire ocean-going ship, beautifully built, its carved prow spiraling up exactly as it did the day it was made, and inside it, the dead, surrounded by everything the living thought they would need on the far side. In one of the most famous of all, 2 women were buried together in a magnificent ship, laid out with an astonishing wealth of goods: sledges, a wagon, beds, looms, kitchen equipment, the tools of weaving and of life, animals slaughtered to go with them, a whole household sent forward into the dark. Who they were, we do not fully know. a queen and her servant, a priestess and her companion, 2 women whose names are gone, but whose grave was furnished as if for royalty. The earth kept them and gave them back to us, and we still cannot say for certain who they were, only that someone loved or feared or honored them enough to sink a fortune into the ground on their behalf. And think about what a ship burial actually costs. A longship was the single most valuable, most labor-intensive, most precious object these people could make. Months of work, the finest oak, the irreplaceable skill of the shipwright, the thing that meant wealth and mobility and survival and war. And they took that, the most valuable object in their world, and they buried it. Sank it into a hole in the ground to rot, along with treasure and food and slaughtered animals and sometimes other human beings, so that the dead would not go into the next world poor. You do not do that for a god you half believe in. You do not do that as a gesture. You do that because you are certain, bone certain, the way they were certain of the cold and the dark and the failing harvest, that the journey is real, that the dead go on, that they will need the ship and the food and the goods where they are going, and that to send them off without these things would be to abandon them. The grave goods are not symbols. They are provisions. They are love, made of the most expensive things in the world, poured into the ground. But it was not always only goods that went into the ground with the dead. Sometimes, it was people. I told you we would come to one account, and now we have arrived at it. And I want you to brace yourself, because it is the closest thing we have to actually standing beside one of these funerals and watching it happen with our own eyes. It comes from an outsider, a learned, devout man from a great civilization far to the south and east, a diplomat and a writer, who traveled north on an embassy and encountered a community of these northern people living along a great river deep in the east, far from home, where they had settled to trade. He was a sophisticated man from a sophisticated world, and he watched these people with a mixture of fascination and disgust, and crucially, unlike the terrified monks, he sat down afterward and wrote, in careful detail, exactly what he saw. His account is precious beyond measure, precisely because he was a neutral, alien observer, neither victim nor kinsman, simply a man trying to record an astonishing thing he had witnessed. And what he witnessed was the funeral of one of their chieftains. He describes how, when the chieftain died, his body was set aside while the elaborate preparations were made. He describes the ship hauled up out of the river and set on a great platform of wood. He describes the wealth that was gathered to send the dead man forward, the food, the drink, the weapons, the animals slaughtered one after another, horses run until they sweated and then cut down, all of it laid in or around the ship. And he describes how, when the chieftain died, the question was put to his slaves, who will die with him? And how one of them, a young woman, said that she would. And from that moment, for the days of preparation that followed, that young woman was treated not as a slave, but as something close to a queen. She was given fine things. She was attended, honored, made much of, allowed to drink and to take her ease while the others worked. She moved through the days before the funeral in a kind of elevated, set-apart state, the center of everyone's attention, the chosen one, the one who was going. And we cannot know, the writer could not know, and we certainly cannot know across all this distance, what was actually happening inside her in those days. Whether she went toward it willingly, in the deep sense, believing she was about to be reunited with her Lord in a paradise far better than the life of a slave she was leaving behind. Whether the wine and the ritual and the honor were a comfort or a trap, or both at once. Whether, underneath the ceremony, there was terror. The account suggests that near the very end, as the moment approached, something in her did flinch, did falter, did perhaps try to draw back, and that the ritual simply carried her forward regardless, over her hesitation, to its conclusion. She was killed, and her body was placed in the ship beside the dead chieftain. And then the whole thing, the ship, the goods, the slaughtered animals, the dead man, and the young woman who had said she would go with him, was set on fire and burned on the bank of the great river, until there was nothing left but ash and a memory in the mind of a horrified foreign diplomat who would carry it home and write it down and hand it across 1,000 years to us. I have told you that story carefully, and not for the horror of it, though it is horrifying. I have told it to you because it does something that nothing else in this entire history can quite do. It collapses the distance. It puts a real, particular, individual human being in front of you. A young woman with no name, a slave, in a ritual we can barely comprehend, and it refuses to let her be a symbol. It refuses to let any of them be symbols, because that funeral contained, all at once, every single thing this age was. The staggering generosity toward the dead, the absolute conviction that the journey beyond was real, the breathtaking wealth poured into the ground, the artistry, the ritual, the belief, and, woven straight through the middle of all of it, the brutal, unblinking fact that some of these people owned other people and could decide that one of them would die, and that the line between honor and atrocity in this world did not run where we would draw it. It is beautiful, and it is monstrous, and it is the same act. That is the age. That is what we keep running into. You cannot keep the beauty and throw away the horror. They came in one ship. And that brings us to the thing this whole story has been circling. The thing under the trade and the exploration and the silver, the dark engine that the romantic picture works hardest of all to hide. Because that young woman on the riverbank was not an accident. She was not an aberration. She was part of a system, an enormous, ordinary, profitable system that ran underneath the entire northern world and stretched from the cold valleys to the markets of the east, and that touched, in one way or another, almost every single person in this story. These people were slavers, and the buying and selling of human beings was not a shameful secret at the edge of their society. It was one of its central economic engines. To understand the Viking Age, really understand it, not the version with the horns, you have to follow the chains. We have to say the unvarnished thing plainly, because the romantic picture has spent 2 centuries helping us look away from it. A very large part of what these men were doing when they raided was not stealing gold, it was stealing people. When a longship came up a river and fell on a village or a monastery, the silver and the cattle were only part of the prize. The other part, often the more valuable part, was the human beings. The young and the strong and the healthy were rounded up, bound, dragged down to the ships, and carried away to be sold. The monks of the burning churches did not only lose their treasures, many of them lost their freedom, and their futures, and their names, hauled off into a life of bondage from which they would never return. And it was a business. That is the part that should sit coldly in your stomach. This was not occasional cruelty. It was a vast, organized, profitable trade in living human beings, and these people were among the most active and far-reaching slave traders of their entire era. They built whole towns around it. A great trading settlement on the coast of Ireland, which would one day grow into a famous capital city, began in large part as a slave market, a hub where captives seized from the coasts of the British Isles and beyond were gathered, held, valued, and shipped onward to be sold across the known world. The chains ran from the raided villages of the West all the way to the wealthy markets of the South and the East, and the men of the North grew rich moving human cargo along them. Think about what that actually means at the human scale, because the scale is where the horror lives. It means that a great many of the people in this story whom we have been getting to know, the farmers, the women with the keys, the families in the smoky longhouse, owned other human beings. The thralls, they called them, the unfree. And the thralls did the worst of the work, the heaviest and the filthiest, on the farms and in the households of the very people whose daily lives we have been trying so hard to humanize. The woman running the farm while her husband was at sea was running it, in many cases, on the forced labor of people who had themselves been someone's family, in some other village, before the ships came. The longhouse we entered together, with its firelight and its stories and its huddled warmth against the dark, That warmth was kept, in part, by people who were there against their will, who had been torn from their own homes, who had their own buried children and their own grief and their own names that no one bothered to write down. The comfort and the cruelty were, once again, the same room. And the thralls leave almost no trace, because that is what slavery does. It erases. They were not buried in ships. They were not carved into runestones. They did not have poets to make them remembered. They were, in the brutal accounting of their owners, a kind of property, a tool, a thing. And so they passed through this world and out of it, leaving almost nothing behind. No name, no story, no grave that announces itself. The young woman on the riverbank is the great exception, precisely because a foreigner happened to write her down. For every one of her, there were thousands upon thousands who simply vanished into bondage and were never recorded at all. When we mourn the forgotten of this age, when we stand at the runestones and grieve for the sons who died in the East, we should remember that the truly forgotten, the ones with no stone and no story and no one left to mourn them, are very often the people these very same societies had bought and sold. The Viking Age remembered its warriors. It worked very hard to forget the people its warriors carried away in chains. I am dwelling on this because it is the necessary corrective to everything that comes next. Because what comes next is genuinely astonishing. The reach of these people, the distances they crossed, the worlds they touched, is one of the great stories in all of human history. And it is easy to get swept up in the wonder of it. But the wonder rode on the back of the chains. The same ships that carried explorers to the edge of the unknown world carried captives to the markets. The same restless courage that planted farms on the shore of a new continent fell on sleeping villages and dragged the survivors away. You cannot have one without the other. They are the same people, the same ships, the same age. Hold the chains in your mind as we go. They are the shadow under all the glory. Because now we have to widen the lens, all the way out, and confront the single most underappreciated fact about these people. The raids were never the point. The raids were the loud, bloody, visible beginning of something far larger and far quieter and far more world-changing. These people did not just attack the world. They went out into it, and they stayed, and they remade enormous parts of it. And the map of the modern world still carries their fingerprints in places most of us have never thought to look. Follow them west first, across the worst water on Earth, because that is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. They did not stop at raiding the coasts of Britain and Ireland and the kingdoms of the Franks, though they did all of that, and settled great swaths of it, and left their blood and their language permanently mixed into those peoples. They kept going, out past the edge of the known world. They found and settled remote islands in the open Atlantic that no human being had ever lived on before. They reached an island of fire and ice at the very rim of the habitable world, and built an entire society there from nothing, a free society, with no king, governed by an assembly where free men gathered once a year on a plain of black rock to make law and settle disputes. One of the oldest such gatherings in the human record, the distant ancestor of parliaments. They created, on a frozen island in the middle of nowhere, a functioning civilization with its own law and its own literature. And it was there, generations later, that the old stories were finally written down, which is the reason we know almost anything at all about the gods and the heroes and the lost faith. The far western edge of their world preserved the memory the Christian center erased. And still they did not stop. From that island of fire and ice, they pushed further west, into water even more hostile, and found a vast frozen coast that one of them, in a piece of marketing as bold and as dishonest as any in history, named for its green, to lure settlers to a land that was anything but. And there, on the edge of that immense ice, they built farms and churches and a community that would last for centuries, clinging to the very margin of where human life was possible, further from the rest of their people than any settlement had ever been. We will come back to that frozen colony because its story is one of the saddest and most haunting in this entire history, and I am saving it, deliberately, for near the end, because what happened to it is, in miniature, what happened to the whole age. But even the frozen edge of the world was not the end of them, because somewhere around the year 1000, 500 years before the voyage everyone has heard of, the one we were all taught was the first, a small group of these people, blown off course or pushing deliberately into the unknown, sailed west from their frozen colony and made landfall on the shore of a continent that no European had ever set foot on, North America. They were there. We are not guessing. We have found the place, the remains of their settlement, the buildings, the worked iron, the unmistakable evidence sitting in the ground on the far edge of the New World, dated centuries before the famous expeditions that have all the glory. They reached America. They built shelters. They explored. A child may have been born there, a European child on American soil 1,000 years ago. And then they left. That is the part that haunts me. They got there, against all the odds, across the most lethal ocean on Earth, to a land of timber and game and possibility. And within a few short years, they abandoned it and sailed away and never came back. The reasons were probably practical and human and unglamorous. They were too few, too far from home, and the people already living on that continent met them with a fierce resistance that a tiny band of settlers at the end of an impossibly long supply line could not overcome. So they turned around. They went home. And the knowledge of what they had found faded into a few half-remembered stories, told by firelight on a frozen island, and then into nothing. And the continent waited another 500 years to be found again by people who had never heard of them. They touched the future of the entire world, and then let it go, and forgot, and the door closed for half a millennium. It is one of history's great near misses. A road not taken, on the far edge of an ocean, by a handful of people whose names we will never know. And now turn around completely, and follow the other half of them, east. Because while some of these people were sailing into the empty Western Ocean, others were going in the exact opposite direction, and what they did there changed the map of the world even more permanently. They went east, into the great forests and rivers of the lands we now call Russia and Ukraine. And they did there what they did everywhere. They traded, they raided, they settled, and they took. But the rivers of the east did not run to empty islands. They ran south, all the way south, through the heart of a continent, toward the richest and most magnificent civilizations on Earth. So picture it, these same northern men, who had begun by falling on undefended monasteries, now hauling their ships overland between the headwaters of mighty rivers, fighting the current and the rapids and the hostile tribes, pushing south and south and south down the great river roads of the east, until they arrived at the walls of the greatest city in the entire world, the capital of an empire that traced itself back to Rome, a city of 500,000 people when the towns of the north held a few thousand, a city of domes and gold and silk and emperors, the dazzling, almost unimaginable center of the civilized world. The men of the smoky longhouses came down the rivers and stood before that city and were so awestruck that they gave it a name in their own tongue that meant simply the Great City, the city beyond all other cities. And here the story turns again, the way it always does. Because the emperor of that great city, who could have any soldiers in the world, looked at these enormous, fearless, far-traveled northern men and decided he wanted them not as enemies, but as his personal bodyguard, his elite, the warriors who would stand closest to the throne and protect the most powerful man on earth. And so, for generations, young men born in the cold valleys of the far north, restless second sons with no land, the very same kind of men who had begun this whole age by burning the church at Lindisfarne, traveled the entire length of the known world, down the rivers and across the seas, to serve as the bodyguard of an emperor in a golden city, growing wealthy in his service, carving their names into the marble of an ancient cathedral where those carvings can still be read today, and then, some of them, carrying their fortunes all the way back home to the farms they had come from, to live out their days as rich men in the country that had had no place for them when they were young. The reach of it is almost too much to hold in the mind at once. From a windswept beach in the British Isles to a frozen colony on the edge of the New World, from the shore of North America to the marble of the greatest cathedral in the East, from the slave markets of Ireland to the bodyguard of an emperor. Following the silver, always the silver, vast rivers of it flowing up from the markets of the South and the distant East, hundreds of thousands of coins minted in lands the farmers of the North could not have located on any map, ending up buried in hoards in cold northern fields where we still dig them up today. These people, whom we were taught to picture as savages at the edge of the world, had in fact stitched the world together, west to a new continent, east to the gates of an ancient empire, and everything in between bound by the slim wooden ships and the restless men who sailed them. For a few generations, the northern world was not the edge of anything. It was the thread that ran through all of it. And yet, for all that reach, for all that astonishing human achievement, there was a place where the thread finally pulled too thin. A place at the very furthest western edge of everything they built, where a few hundred of these people clung to existence on the rim of the ice, further from home than anyone, and where the great story of the Viking Age would play out its ending in the smallest and most intimate and most heartbreaking way possible. To understand how an entire age dies, we should go there now, to the frozen colony, to the people at the end of the world, and to the long, slow, silent way they were forgotten. They came to the frozen land in the generation that everything was at its height, bold, confident, certain that the same courage and skill that had conquered the open ocean could conquer anything. They settled in the few green valleys at the heads of the long fjords, where the ice drew back just enough in summer to let the grass grow, and they built their farms exactly as they had built them at home. The longhouses, the byres for the animals, the pastures, the whole familiar machinery of survival, transplanted to the very rim of the habitable world. They raised cattle and sheep. They built churches of stone because by now they were Christians, and we will come to how that happened. They traded the one thing their frozen land had in abundance, the ivory of the great tusked sea beasts prized across all of Europe, for the iron and the timber and the grain and the luxuries they could not produce themselves. For a while, it worked. For a while, against all reason, there was a thriving European society on the edge of the Arctic ice. Hundreds of people, a bishop, churches, farms, a whole small world. But think about how that world actually held together. It held together by a thread, a single long thread of ships, stretching back across the worst ocean on Earth to the homeland. Everything depended on those ships. The colony could not make its own iron in any quantity. It could not grow enough grain. It could not get timber for building beyond the driftwood the sea brought in and the rare voyages further west to the wooded coast. It could not even, in the end, build new ships of its own because it had no trees large enough. So every single thing that made European life possible on that ice, the tools, the iron, the cloth, the grain, the contact with the world, the very ships that were the colony's lifeline, all of it had to come from far away, across the deadly water, in the holds of vessels that arrived less and less often as the centuries wore on. The colony was a held breath. It survived only as long as the thread held. And slowly, across 200 years, 300, the thread began to fray. The reasons were many, and they wove together exactly the way the Titanic's 1,000 small failures wove together on one night, except here it happened across centuries, so slowly that no single generation could see the shape of what was happening to them. The climate turned. The warm spell that had let them settle gave way to a long, deep, brutal cooling, the kind of slow planetary shift that no one living through it could perceive, but that meant, year by year, decade by decade, shorter summers, longer winters, worse harvests, more ice in the fjords, more ice on the sea lanes, fewer and fewer ships able to make the crossing at all. The pack ice crept down and choked the routes home. The market for their precious ivory collapsed as new sources opened elsewhere, and tastes changed in distant cities the colonists would never see. So the one thing they had to trade became worth less and less. And the homeland itself? Ravaged by its own catastrophes. A great plague that emptied half of Europe. Wars, The simple drifting of attention away from a colony at the end of nowhere, slowly, without ever quite deciding to, forgot about them. Picture it from inside. Picture being one of these people, in the final generations, on a farm at the head of a fjord on the edge of the ice, watching for the ships. Your grandparents told you that ships used to come every year. Your parents remember when they came sometimes. And in your lifetime, they come almost never. And then, finally, they stop coming at all. And there is no announcement, no final ship that says, "This is the last one. This is goodbye." There is only a horizon that you watch in the short summers, year after year, that stays empty. The world did not abandon them in a single dramatic act. It abandoned them by degrees, by attrition, by simply ceasing to arrive, until one summer the people on the ice understood, without anyone ever telling them, that no one was coming anymore, that they were alone, that they had always, in the end, been alone, and that the thread back to the world of warmth and iron and family and the gods of their ancestors had not been cut so much as allowed, by everyone, slowly, to rot. And here is the detail that I cannot get out of my head. The detail that makes the whole vast abstraction of a dying civilization suddenly, unbearably human. We have the last written record from that colony, a single document recording a wedding. A wedding. Two young people on the edge of the ice, at the end of the world, standing in a stone church their ancestors had built, being married, beginning a life together, planning a future. And after that wedding, the records simply stop. There is nothing more. No more documents, no more letters, no more contact. That wedding is the last thing we know that the people of the frozen colony did. And then the silence comes down, total and final. And behind it, the colony lived on for some unknown stretch of years, and then died. And no one was there to write down how, or when, or who was the last. We can only read the ending in the ground. And the ground tells a slow, grim story. The archaeologists who have dug the final farms find the signs of a community contracting, struggling, dying by inches. The bones of the animals in the trash heaps of the last years tell of a people eating things they would never have touched in better times. The hunting dogs, the newborn livestock that should have been the future of the herd, the very animals that were the colony's only hope of going on, slaughtered and eaten because there was nothing else. The seed corn of their survival consumed in the final hunger. We find farms where the people seem simply to have died where they were, or to have gathered into the last few viable holdings as the others were abandoned one by one. We find no sign of a battle, no massacre, no single catastrophe, just an ending. Just a slow, cold, silent diminishing, on the edge of the ice, with no one watching, until the last longhouse went quiet, and the last fire went out, and the snow came in through the fallen roof, and the wind blew through the empty stone churches, and the European colony at the edge of the New World, which had lasted for nearly 500 years, was simply gone, as if it had never been there at all. No one knows who the last one was. There is no name, no grave that announces itself, no final word. Somewhere out there on the ice is the place where the last person of the frozen colony died, the last living memory of an entire transplanted world, the last one who remembered the stories, the last one who watched the empty horizon for the ships. And we will never know who they were, or what they thought about, at the end, alone. They went into the silence as completely as the slave girl with no name, as completely as the sons who died in the East, as completely as almost everyone in this entire history. The frozen colony is the Viking Age in miniature. A bold beginning, a magnificent reach, a clinging to the very edge of the possible, and then a slow forgetting, a thread allowed to rot, a light going out in the dark with no one there to see it, and finally, Nothing left but the silent things in the ground for someone, centuries later, to find and wonder over. And that, in the end, is what was happening to the whole age. Not on the ice, but everywhere. The frozen colony just did it most starkly, most visibly, most alone. The entire world these people had built was being allowed to end. Some of it died in cold and hunger, like the colony. But most of it died in a far stranger way, a way the people living through it mostly welcomed, mostly chose, mostly believed was a kind of salvation. Most of the Viking Age did not die. It converted. And to understand the true end of these people, the real last chapter, we have to understand how a whole civilization came to lay down its old gods and its old fate and its old fierce answer to death and pick up something entirely new, and in doing so, quietly, willingly, stop being what it had been. The new faith did not arrive the way the old picture might suggest, in a sudden blaze of conversion or at the point of a sword. It seeped in. It came up the same trade routes the silver came up, carried by merchants and missionaries and the simple gravitational pull of the great Christian kingdoms to the south. And at first, it did not replace the old gods so much as stand beside them. We can see this with our own eyes, in the ground, in one of the most quietly telling objects of the entire age. We have found, in the graves of this transition, people buried wearing two things at once around their necks: a small hammer, the symbol of the old thunder god, the defender of ordinary people, and a cross. Both, at the same time, on the same person. We have even found a craftsman's mold, a single soapstone mold, carved to cast both hammers and crosses side by side, so that the smith could make whichever the customer wanted, or both, out of the same fire, on the same day. Picture that smith. Picture the customer. This is not the clash of civilizations we are taught to imagine. This is a person hedging. This is a person who has heard about the new God, the powerful God, the God of the rich southern kingdoms and the wealthy traders, and who is not quite ready to give up the old ones, the familiar ones, the gods of their parents and their parents' parents, the thunder god who had always protected the farm. So they wore both. They covered every possibility. They lived for a generation or two in the overlap, the in-between, the long, uncertain dusk where the old faith and the new one shared the same neck and the same hearth and the same anxious human heart, trying to guess which way the world was turning. There is something almost unbearably recognizable in it. The hedging, the not quite letting go, the wearing of the new alongside the old, just in case. But the world was turning, and it was turning for reasons that had very little to do with the truth of either God. It was turning because of power. Remember the North as we found it. Hundreds of small communities, no kings, no center, chieftains and farmers and assemblies, a world without a master. That world was ending too, at exactly the same time, and the two endings were the same ending, because ambitious men were beginning to do something no one in the North had done before. They were forging the small scattered communities into kingdoms, conquering and bribing and marrying their way into power over wider and wider stretches of land, building the thing the North had never had, a king. And these new kings discovered something that kings everywhere have always discovered. The new faith was the perfect tool for the new power. The old religion, with its scattered local gods and its fierce independent free men, and its assemblies where any man could speak, was a religion for a world of equals. The new religion, with its single, all-powerful God above, its single hierarchy, its kings ruling by divine right as God's chosen authority on earth, was a religion built for kingship. To become a Christian king was to borrow the entire architecture of a god to hold up your throne. And so the conversion of the North was, to a very large degree, a decision made at the top and pressed downward. A king would convert, often for reasons as much political as spiritual: alliance with the southern powers, legitimacy, trade, the simple calculation of advantage. And then he would impose the new faith on his people, sometimes gently, sometimes with brutal force, tearing down the old shrines, outlawing the old sacrifices, killing those who clung too publicly to the old gods. One of these kings raised a great stone, a monument that still stands, on which he boasted in the angular old letters that he had won for himself the whole of his realm and made his people Christian. Read that boast again. He listed the two achievements together, side by side, as if they were the same achievement, the unifying of the kingdom and the converting of the people, because to him, they were. The crown and the cross went up together. The free, scattered, God-crowded world of the longhouses was being gathered into the fist of kings, and the new God was the glove on the fist. And here is what was lost, in the deepest sense, when the old faith went down. And it is not what you might think. It was not the gods themselves. Gods come and go, and most people, then as now, went on with their farms and their fears much as before. What was lost was the answer. That fierce, clear-eyed, tragic answer to death that we spent so long with. The doomed gods fighting on. The fixed and certain end met standing. The freedom found inside the prison of fate. The reputation that alone outlives the grave. The new faith brought a completely different answer. It said, "Death is not the end. There is a heaven, a real and eternal one, where the good are rewarded forever, and the point of life is not to be remembered, but to be saved." It was, in many ways, a gentler answer, a more hopeful one. To people who had lived their whole lives certain that the darkness always won in the end, the promise of a light that did not go out must have been almost overwhelming, a release from the long, brave, exhausting work of facing the dark without flinching. You can understand why they took it. You can understand why a person who had buried child after child in the cold ground would weep with relief to be told that the children were not gone, that they were waiting, that there would be a reunion in a kingdom where nothing died. The new faith won in the end, not by the sword, but because it offered the one thing the old faith had always, on principle, refused to offer. It offered comfort. It offered an escape from the dark. And after a few hundred years of staring the dark in the face, the people of the North were ready, more than ready, to be allowed to look away. So the age did not so much fall as dissolve. The kings consolidated, the faith converted. The longships kept sailing, but now they sailed under crosses, carrying kings' armies in the wars of a Christian Europe these people had become a part of rather than a threat to. The raids became conquests, and the conquests became kingdoms, and the kingdoms became simply part of the medieval world, indistinguishable in the end from the soft southern lands their grandfathers had plundered. And then, on a single day, in a single battle, the age that had begun on the beach at Lindisfarne reached its symbolic end, and it ended in the most fitting and ironic way imaginable. In the autumn of the year 1066, a great northern king, the last of the old breed, a giant of a man, who had himself served in the bodyguard of the emperor in the great eastern city, sailed to England to seize its throne by force, the old way, the Viking way. And he was met by an English army, and in a hard battle near a river crossing, he was killed, and his invasion was destroyed. And the last great attempt to conquer in the old northern style died with him on an English field. That, by long tradition, is the end of the Viking Age, the last act of the old world. But here is the irony that makes it perfect. 3 weeks later, that very same English king, his army exhausted and bloodied from defeating the northern invasion, had to march the length of his kingdom to meet a second invader landing on the southern coast. And he lost, and he was killed, and England was conquered after all. And who was the conqueror? Who were these new invaders from across the southern sea? They were the descendants of these very same northern people. Generations earlier, a band of these raiders had been given land in northern France in exchange for ceasing their raids, and they had settled there and adopted the local language and the local faith and the local ways and become something new. And now, their grandchildren, no longer calling themselves men of the North, no longer sailing longships, no longer worshipping the old gods, came back across the water as French-speaking Christian knights and conquered England for good. The Viking Age was ended, in the same season, by an old-style Viking king dying on a battlefield, and by a new-style, transformed Viking people winning one. The age died at the hands of both what it had been and what it had become. The wolf that finally swallowed the old world was, in the end, the old world's own grandchildren, wearing a new face, speaking a new tongue, carrying a new god, and remembering nothing of where they had come from. And that is how an age ends. Not all at once, not in a single night the way a ship goes down, but by transformation, by conversion, by the slow turning of children into something their grandparents would not have recognized, until one day, the thing that had been is simply gone, dissolved into what came after, leaving behind only the silent evidence in the ground and the strange persistence of a few things too deep to erase. And yet, after everything, after the conversion and the kings and the dissolving and the forgetting, after the cartoon was painted over the truth and the horns were nailed onto the dead, these people are not gone. That is the strange final turn of their story, and it is the one that brings us, at last, all the way back to the comb in the cold ground where we began. They are still here, not as the monsters of the legend, and not even, mostly, as a memory anyone is conscious of carrying. They are here in ways so deep and so woven into the ordinary world that we walk through them every day without ever once noticing. Listen, for instance, to your own mouth. If you speak English, you speak, every single day, with words these people left behind. Words their longships carried up the rivers and into the language and never took back out again. The word for the sky over your head. The word for the window you look through. The word for the knife on your table. The word you use for your husband, for your sister's children, for the law you live under, for the very ground beneath your feet in 100 place names scattered across the lands they settled. Even the small grammatical bones of the language, some of the most basic words there are, the words for they and them and their, were quietly handed to English by these people and have been doing their work in every sentence since. You cannot speak for a single minute without the dead of the North speaking through you. The civilization that was supposedly destroyed and forgotten is hiding, in plain sight, inside the most ordinary sentences you will ever say. And they are here, in the blood. Across the lands they raided and settled and ruled, in the British Isles and far beyond, the genetic traces of these people are woven through the living populations, not as some exotic remnant, but as a simple, common, unremarkable part of who millions of people now are, mixed and remixed across 1,000 years until it is no longer Northern blood, or English blood, or Irish blood, but simply blood, simply people, simply the long human result of all that sailing and settling and staying. The descendants of the men in the longships are everywhere, walking around, going to work, living lives that have no idea where some small part of them came from. The age did not end. It dispersed. It became us. But the truest thing they left, the thing that brings the whole story full circle, is the thing they cared about most and feared losing most and reached for most desperately across their entire haunted relationship with death. They wanted to be remembered. And against all the odds, against the conversion and the forgetting and the 1,000 years of distortion, a few of them are. Go and stand, if you ever can, before one of the runestones, those terse, angular memorials raised by grieving families 1,000 years ago, still standing in fields and churchyards across the Old North. Read what they say in the careful translations beside them. They are almost never boasts of conquest. They are, overwhelmingly, the simplest and most human thing imaginable. They are families saying, this person was here, this person was loved. A father raised this stone for his son, a wife for her husband. A mother for the boy who sailed east and never came home and fed the eagles in some far land, and whose body lies in ground she will never see, and who has no grave but this stone, this name, these few cut words, set up on a cold hillside by a woman who could not bear for him to vanish, and who reached across 1,000 years without knowing it to make absolutely certain that you, today, would know that he had lived. She succeeded. That is the staggering thing. She had no idea who you are. She could not have imagined you, and she beat death anyway on his behalf by carving his name into the one thing that lasts. And here you are, 1,000 years later, knowing that her son existed, which is the only immortality these people ever believed in, and the only one, perhaps, that any of us ever really gets. So they were right, in the end, about the one thing that mattered most to them.
The cattle died, and the kinsmen died, and they themselves died, every one, the way they always knew they would. But the memory, the name cut in stone, the deed bound into verse, the story told and retold by firelight until it found its way, somehow, across the centuries and the silence and the ocean of forgetting, all the way to a stranger in a far-off age who would speak it aloud one more time. The memory did not die. It is the most fragile thing they made, and it has outlasted the iron and the ships and the gods and the kingdoms and everything else they built. It outlasted the longhouses, which are gone. It outlasted the empire they guarded, which is gone. It outlasted the colony on the ice, which is gone. It outlasted even the cartoon we painted over them, which is, finally, slowly, beginning to come off. And underneath it, when you scrape the cartoon away, you find not a monster and not a hero, but something far harder to look at, and far more worth looking at. You find a people who lived closer to the cold edge of survival than almost any of us can imagine, who buried more of their children than they raised, who faced a darkness they refused to lie to themselves about, and who built, out of that darkness, not despair, but a fierce and generous and courageous way of being alive. People who bathed and braided their hair and carried combs to the grave. People who carved beasts into the prows of ships they loved like cathedrals. People who held property and ran farms and walked away from bad marriages and may, sometimes, have taken up the sword. People who owned other people and burned slaves on the funeral pyres of their lords and dragged the children of strangers away in chains, because they were that too, all of it, the beauty and the horror in the same hull, and they would not have understood our need to keep one and disown the other. People who sailed off the edge of the known world for no better reason than that the world had no room for them at home, and who touched 2 continents and an empire and the rim of the ice, and who wanted, more than gold, more than land, more than life itself, simply not to be forgotten. They are dissolving now, the same way the ship in the cold Atlantic is dissolving. The longhouses long since rotted back into the green hills, the bones gone soft in the acid ground, the names on the stones weathering, letter by letter, year by year, back toward the silence they were carved to hold off. One day even the runestones will be smooth blank rock again, and the last word of the last grieving mother will be erased by the same patient weather that takes everything in the end. The ground that remembered them will, in time, forget them too. But not yet. Not today. Today the comb is still in the museum case, and the ship still rises out of the burial clay, and the stone on the hillside still says the boy was loved, and the words they left are still in your mouth, and the story, their story, the real one, without the horns, is still being told. And as long as it is told, they are not entirely gone. They live where they always wanted to live, the only place anything truly lasts, in the telling, in the remembering, in the names spoken aloud one more time by someone who never knew them and never could. So remember them, the man with the comb, the woman with the keys, the child in the smoke, the slave with no name, the son who fed the eagles in the east. The last one on the ice, watching the empty horizon for a ship that was never coming. Remember that they were not monsters, and they were not myths, and they were not a costume in an opera. They were people, frightened, hopeful, cruel, tender, brave, ordinary people, who lived inside a world as real and as solid and as certain as the one you are sitting in right now, and who never once suspected that it would end, and that they would dissolve into language and blood and a few cut stones, and that the only thing left of all of it
would be the one thing they prayed for and could never be sure of. That somebody, someday, would still know that they had been here. We know. After 1,000 years of silence and fire and forgetting, we know. And this, the longships and the longhouses, the gods who knew they would lose, the children buried in the cold, the names cut into stone against the dark, and the whole vanished world that dissolved so quietly into the one we live in now. This was one of history's last chapters,